When the B-29 entered service, it was already the most expensive weapons project of World War II, costing up to $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project. The idea behind it was that it would be the most technologically advanced bomber that could fly faster, higher, and reach further than any other bomber before it, to battle Japan in the Pacific. However, turning that idea into reality would prove to be an engineering nightmare. In the 1930s, driven by imperialistic ambitions and the desire for resources, Japan sought to establish dominance in the Pacific. It began rapidly expanding its territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This caught the attention of the Americans, who would impose economic sanctions, including an embargo on oil exports, which Japan was heavily dependent on. Japan's response to this would send shockwaves across America and alter the course of history in the Pacific forever.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan launched a devastating surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack damaged and sank numerous ships, killing more than 2,400 Americans. This event propelled the United States into the Pacific War, ultimately leading to plans for bomber operations launched from Allied bases across the Pacific. However, the current bombers in America's fleet, such as the B-17 and B-24, didn't have enough range to be able to penetrate deep into Japanese territory, and lacked the payload to cause enough damage. The Japanese knew this, and launched an attack mission on Pearl Harbor as a strategic tactic to take advantage of this vulnerability. What the Japanese didn't know was that the United States was already 2 steps ahead of them. A year before the attack, the United States Army Air Corps issued a request to 5 major aircraft manufacturers to submit designs for a so-called superbomber with a speed of 400 miles an hour, a range of over 5,000 feet, and the capability to carry and drop 20,000 pounds of bombs. 4 companies submitted designs, but only 2 advanced to the prototype stage. Consolidated Aircraft, with their Model 33, and Boeing, who had been studying long-range bombers for the past 2 years already, submitted their Model 345. It was a major upgrade from its predecessor, the B-17, introducing new pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, controlled via computerized central fire control systems, and 4 high-power Radar 3350 engines that would enable the aircraft to reach the required speed, while the much larger airframe resulted in an increase in payload capacity, and the addition of larger fuel tanks would allow the bomber to penetrate deep into Japan from faraway bases. Feeling confident in Boeing's design, the United States Army Air Corps ordered 3 flying prototypes, which were designated as XB-29s, and a single airframe for static testing. Consolidated continued working on their design as a backup in case there were any problems with Boeing's design, which in hindsight was a good idea because manufacturing the XB-29 would prove to be a complex task, one that would involve working in freezing cold temperatures, delivering the bomber across 4 different states, and many setbacks. In May of 1941, Boeing received an order for 14 service test bombers and 250 production bombers. In January of 1942, this order increased to 500 bombers. The combination of a highly advanced bomber design, challenging requirements, and immense pressure for production caused setbacks. The first unarmed prototype flew successfully. The flight of the second prototype, armed with remote-controlled gun turrets, had to be terminated due to engine fire. The third flight also experienced an engine fire, but the crew wasn't so lucky. The plane crashed into a building, killing the pilot, crew of 10, 20 workers, and a local firefighter. The culprit was a Radar 3350 engine that was prone to overheating. The issue was that the rear cylinders of the 18-cylinder power plant didn't receive enough cooling airflow. It would have been easier to just replace the engine. However, there were no other American power plant that had the necessary power and low fuel consumption to meet the required speed and range. Additionally, designing a new engine would have delayed the entire program even more, so temporary solutions were used instead, which included cuffs to increase airflow to the intakes, thorough pre-flight inspections, and replacing the uppermost 5 cylinders every 25 hours of engine time and the entire engine every 75 hours. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it did improve reliability by reducing overheating and engine failures. Another issue with the B-29 was how it was built. Because it was urgently needed, the B-29 was mass-produced before its development was finished. In a normal program, the aircraft would be designed, tested, and redesigned to get the perfect design. This is the development phase. When it's ready, it enters production, where it's produced in factories in large numbers. With the B-29 program, the development and production of the aircraft happened at the same time. This meant that by the time a bomber rolled out of the factory, new fixes were found, and the bomber had to be sent to a modification center to be rebuilt. This slowed down the entire program. By the end of 1943, even though over 100 bombers were built, only 15 were airworthy. This prompted General Henry H. Arnold to personally visit one of the factories in January of 1944 and demanded rapid progress. When he returned 2 months later, he discovered that because of this process, modification centers had become too overwhelmed, and he immediately took action in an emergency effort that became known as the Battle of Kansas, with the goal of getting as many B-29s combat ready. To achieve this, production personnel was sent from production centers to modification centers to work on getting B-29s that were already built ready for combat. One of the problems faced during this was that the giant 141-foot wingspan of the B-29 couldn't fit in most buildings, so mechanics were often forced to work outdoors in freezing weather conditions. Because of these efforts though, 150 bombers were modified in just 5 weeks. A few weeks later, on the 8th of May 1944, the B-29 finally entered service. By that time, it had become the most expensive weapons project of the Second World War, costing more than the Manhattan Project at the time. The B-29 would go on to have one of the biggest impacts of the war. The first B-29 operations were conducted from bases in China and India under Operation Matterhorn, targeting Japan and Japanese-held territory. However, these missions suffered from severe logistical constraints, including fuel shortages and difficult supply routes. The Chinese bases were too distant to sustain effective strikes deep into Japan. To solve this, the United States captured the Mariana Islands in 1944. From bases on these islands, the B-29s could finally reach the Japanese mainland, enabling large-scale strategic bombing campaigns and some of the most destructive air raids of the war. Perhaps its most notable impact in the war was its involvement in the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. On the 6th of June 1945, a modified B-29 carrying the Little Boy atomic bomb flew over Hiroshima and deployed its weapon, creating one of the most horrifying images in war. A few days later, the Fat Man atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The impact of these missions killed a total of around 210,000 people. This led Japanese leadership to conclude that continuing the war was hopeless. 6 days later, Japan announced its surrender of the war. Despite its troublesome beginnings, by the end of the war, the B-29 had transformed from an experimental superbomber into the main strategic bombing weapon used against Japan. Its Wright R-3350 engines would later be replaced with better and more powerful Pratt & Whitney engines. These new engines could run for 400 to 700 hours before needing an overhaul, compared to the 75 hours of the previous engines. It remained in service and was later used in the Korean War, where it was surprisingly effective. However, as a bomber built in the early 1940s, it struggled against newer fighter jets. The B-29 retired on the 21st of June 1960. Its design inspired future bombers that followed it, including Convair's B-39 and a heavily improved redesign of the B-29, the B-50.